What is the government doing about the infrastructure? What is it doing about the bad roads? Have you seen the quality of infrastructure in Singapore? Why can't we have that? What is the government doing with us taxpayers' money? How many times have you said these things or have you heard these questions in a conversation? Come Feb 1st, we will get answers for some of these because the Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, will present the budget for the year 2023-24. Now, before the budget starts, let's have some interesting conversation with some experts who are looking at the infrastructure space. Welcome to Moneycontrol, special pre-budget discussion on infrastructure. I'm Rachita Prasad and I have two special guests with me today who would be talking to us about what to expect from the budget. First up, Manish Aggarwal, who's the partner and head of infrastructure and disinvestment at KPMG in India. Joining him is Arindam Guha, who is the partner of government and public services in Deloitte India. Manish, Arindam, welcome to this chat, and I'm so glad that you are able to join us.
Hi, Rachita.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Arindam.
Hi.
Good to
Hi,
have you.
hi, Manish.
Hi. Thanks for inviting KPMG on the panel, and good to see you both. Thanks.
Great. Let's get started. I mean, before we look at the upcoming budget, let's take a step back and see what happened last year. I mean, the budget last year gave a big 7.5 lakh crore push, a capex push, which was supposed to have a big multiplier effect. I remember the finance minister at the time said that it can have a fiscal multiplier effect of 2.95 and create ripples in the economy. Now, this entire year has been very interesting in the sense that the macroeconomic situation has been quite turbulent, and a lot has happened in India as well. So, if I were to ask you, how has the year panned out in terms of the budget announcements? How much have we managed to achieve? And in terms of infrastructure specifically, how has this year been? What would your take be? Arindam, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Rachita. And I think let me start with the facts themselves, the numbers.
Right.
If you look at the half yearly review of last year's budget expenditure, we will find that there was a total budgeted capex of 7.5 lakh crores, as you said.
Right.
But in addition, there was a grant for capital assets. On that head, we had another 3 lakh crores sitting there. If we were to look at what has been the actual spend totally for the half year from April to September, I think it is on track, and the total spend has been something like 4.7 lakh crores. If you were to compare that with the year before, you will find that there has been a growth of 38% vis-a-vis last year. So it's quite obvious that the government has gone on spending in infrastructure. And there has been an upward trend has promised. I think where we just need to focus on, and maybe we'll talk about that later in your show, is how to really incentivize private investment. Because as far as the government goes, their investment trends have been extremely positive, and they have been spending as per their budget.
Right. Manish, what is your view on this? I mean, Arindam took us through the big numbers. What's happening on the ground? I mean, both of you have your ears to ground. I mean, tell me, what's the pitch report looking like? Is the FM in a situation that he can hit sixes?
Arindam mentioned about the capex numbers, and the government seems to be on track. I think I look at the budget in two or three dimensions. One is about the numbers, and the most important part is around the some of the structural reforms, some of the intent on the policy side, and what you do as the year pans out. I think if you really look at from that color, I think two or three big points. I mean, one, on the PLI scheme, that has been a really game changer to my mind. Government executed it well. It has got moving on the ground, and you see the positive side, because ultimately it is about a larger theme of reducing our import dependence, specifically on the critical sectors. That's point number one. If you look at the point number two, which is for long infrastructure as a sector, for long-term financing, the large domestic financing on the debt side, has been an issue. I think the government announced last year a NAFID as a development financial institution, I think which is getting started now. So the commencement of business is now just starting. And I believe it is also one of the structural reforms, and getting it executed well and operationalized is all 10 out of 10 I will give to the government on that side. If you look at the third key filter, which is on a disinvestment side, again, a very important component because it is a very structural reforms on some of the sectors, demonstrates the government intent. And some of the stuff that the government achieved through DEEPAM, which is LIC IPO, first of its kind, Air India privatization, one of the most toughest one at least that I've seen in the last decade or so of the disinvestment, which gave a very good message on the ground. So very big positive. I would just say that, I mean, as far as asset monetization and the recycling is concerned, which is also very important to have a foreign capital coming into infrastructure as a sector, which is a point Arindam also made, that while the government is spending, you need to also add it up with private capital. I think there I would rate, I mean, the a little bit of a disappointment there on the ground, as it has not panned out to what extent it was envisaged.
That's interesting. I mean, it's been a mixed bag. And from what you two say, I mean, it looks like it's been a mixed bag. A lot of positives, a lot of signals there. But in terms of the ground reality, of course, a lot more can be done. Now, when we are approaching the budget, I mean, it's just around the corner. What is the top expectations? I mean, we've been talking to the industry and we've been writing extensively on Moneycontrol about what the industry is asking for. I mean, the list is long, but if I were to ask you, as somebody who's in touch with the government and also in touch with the industry on a fairly regular basis, what is your sense? What would be the top expectations from this budget for infrastructure? Manish, would you like to take this first?
Yeah, sure. I think, I mean, if I can list down the top three in my mind, and we can take it forward after Arindam comes in. I think if you really look at the budget utilization and the allocation, I believe that expressways, which is highways as well as railways, are the biggest absorption of the capital which is happening. And that is positive and that is good news. But having said that, if you really look at the larger economic growth and the vision that Honorable Prime Minister has set up, I think urban infrastructure is one sector which I believe has actually been lacking in the pace. Now, urban roads, water, seaways, sanitation, with increasing urbanization, I feel that this is a sector where there are two problems which is happening. I think the center allocation has not been high, and this is a sector where the private capital is not coming up because they obviously are not comfortable with some of the risk of dealing with the sector. So one top expectation I would have from the budget is that this year, how to incentivize and act as a catalyst for investments being channelized into this sector, both from a center as well as making it private sector coming into that sector is very important. That's the first key thing I would like to sort of see there, to have a more balanced growth. The second is, I mean, government recently came out with a framework for the sovereign bond offering, I think, which is a great initiative. Having said that, I again believe, and which has been said earlier as well, that the kind of a domestic savings that India can channelize, given the current macro and the forex rates that you feel on some of the dollar denominated sort of a stuff that we want to raise, I think it will give a lot of a long-term capital of a pool without the forex risk if we can channelize that huge savings as well. And the only restriction or only challenge I see is a more liquidity and the market making. Why can't the government use some of the domestic public institutions to really have that market making mechanics addressed, which can pool this capital as well? So that's a second part. And the third one, where before I take us just a pause, is that you look at the current macro, which I think everybody is looking at, recession being in the developed markets, Europe going through its own challenges. So I think if you really look at, while Honorable FM herself has said, India will do relatively better, but I don't think, I mean, we can rely, or I believe we can rely on the high tax buoyancy that we have seen in the last year. And if you really club back with the fact that we have a fiscal deficit targets to be achieved, which that gap has widened up because of a COVID and a post-COVID impact, the headroom that I believe that an honorable finance minister will have will be a little headroom as what probably she would want to do. In that context, asset monetization, I again come back to the fact that that is a disappointment from, and especially given the fact that government came out with a bold reform in NMP, I think asset monetization needs to be completely relooked at as to how it is being addressed currently by the various ministries being left over. I mean, if you really see the disinvestment positive experience, you need what you did on a national land monetization agency as a central agency. You need to have an asset monetization assets, irrespective of which department, transfer to that and actually have a more structured approach to deal with it. Because that's the only way I see that you will get a investor attraction. You can have a line ministry part of that. That's a one. And the second link is the entire PPP side, Rachita. I think enough has been said. Entire PPP framework, to my mind, needs to be rebooted. I think yesterday, a very good initiative that the government did on the port side. They have done away with the TAMP. They have a port education authority formed, and one of the mandates of the that authority is to look at the PPP disputes. Now, this is something I think, if you remember, we have been talking for a long time in the budgets. Why? What I'm saying is that if we can do it for the ports, why can't we do the same structure as an independent body to adjudicate PPP concessions commercially, not legally, as an independent institution where the PPPs like highways, roads, ports, we have seen, or airports, I think that will go a long way to attract a lot of capital and probably take a little bit of a burden off the finance minister back. I will take a pause here and we can discuss a few more that I have in mind.
I see Arindam smiling and nodding. I'm sure he hears a lot from his private sector clients on these issues as well. What is your take on this, Arindam? I mean, in terms of the expectations, what more would you add to this?
No, I think Manish has hit the nail on its head, because you see, if we look at the sectors themselves, roads and railways is where the government has been traditionally spending heavily. In terms of the total expenditure in the forthcoming budget, we do expect government expenditure to be on an upward trend as far as infrastructure is concerned. Now, what about the sectors? I think heavy spends are likely to continue in roads, railways, definitely. But when we look at urban infrastructure, which is the point which Manish emphasized, and I could not agree with him more, what we do expect is that, we need to keep in mind that urban infrastructure falls under the jurisdiction of the state governments. And that's where a lot of issues need to be figured out. You would recollect that 2 years back, the government had introduced this special assistance scheme on capital expenditure by the states, where the states are eligible for a 50-year interest-free loan on the capex they incur on NIP projects particularly. Now, that the first year, I think the budgetary outlay was 10,000 crores. In 2022-23, it was around 1 lakh crores. Now, for the same reasons which Manish mentioned, this year we do expect that expenditure to go up further. Because if we look at budgetary trends, states have been spending around 7-8 lakh crores every year. Because their spend is almost at par with the government of India. So 1 lakh crores as a percentage of 7-8 lakh crores, I think there is scope for upward movement there. So we do expect an increase in outlay on that particular front. Second comes the issue of, in terms of attracting private sector. Because it is very clear that even after government and both central and state spend adequate amounts of investments or make additional adequate investments in the sector, the private sector is the differentiator which can really give a further boost to this sector. Now, we do expect certain credit enhancement mechanisms to be boosted in the budget, because today, if you look at what kind of credit guarantee mechanisms we have in India, I think there is one line which is there, which is administered through IIFCL, where the quantum of support is negligible vis-a-vis the infrastructure spend, which happens annually. If you look at some other countries, like even countries which are close to us, like Indonesia, for example, they have a single window mechanism for providing credit guarantees to public-private partnership projects. What that really does is it improves the credit rating of eligible projects by at least 1 or 2 notches. So if a project is triple B in terms of rating, this kind of credit guarantee can take it to a AA. And that would address the other problem which Manish mentioned, which is limited capital from long term domestic investors like pension funds. Because today, pension funds are not able to invest adequately because their minimum threshold rating for investment is AA. And any such credit enhancement would really help. Similarly, we do hope that the government also considers certain other mechanisms like a securitization platform, which is bundled with asset backed securities. Again, here I think we just need to look at countries like Singapore, which have put together these kind of mechanisms where the government buys out existing loans from bank balance sheets, and then those loans are restructured to issue asset backed securities to institutional investors. So, on one hand, you are freeing up bank balance sheets for further investment into infrastructure, thereby reducing the government's own load. And secondly, you are creating a capital market for infrastructure based asset backed securities. So, these are certain measures which would help attract non government investments into the sector. And finally, I think sovereign green bonds is something which Manish mentioned. I think we finally have it up and going. This is definitely going to be scaled up because it's going to be a further boost for sectors like urban infrastructure. Over the last 3 years, we have seen a fairly dynamic and vibrant municipal bond market. But the issue remains that even for a water recycling project, today municipalities, when they issue bonds, they don't get it categorized as a green bond simply because the sovereign green bond framework was not there. But today we have it. So I think even in terms of existing instruments, this is going to provide a further fillip. Let me stop there.
So you guys, both of you have raised some very important points because directionally we seem to be going in a certain way, which seems to be the right track. And of course, the ambition is really, the aspirations are big, the ambition is big, but there are these things which probably could move faster. And of course, the expectation is that, the finance minister would be able to help on that. But again, she has a tough job. I mean, she's doing a balancing act in terms of how much she can actually do for each of the sectors. And of course, what's happening in the background, what's happening in the macroeconomic environment, like both of you mentioned, I mean, there are recessionary fears, inflation is a concern, and the interest rate environment is looking really like it is going to remain high. So in this backdrop, what would be the biggest challenge for the finance minister right now? And what would be the ways to circumvent it? I mean, do you have any suggestions for her? Manish?
So I think the two quick points. I think as I said that I can empathize with Honorable Finance Minister. This year, she has the room that she has with her is very limited, no doubt about it. I think, and therefore, I just go back to the point that I said on asset monetization and the PPPs. Why that is important is because if you really want to have an ambition that Honorable Prime Minister has on the economic side and the trillions of economy that we want India to grow, I think this momentum of infrastructure spend cannot stop because of these constraints. And if you can't spend more as a government, which is what the government has been doing for the last 2 to 3 years, I think you need to attract a private capital. If you see the private capital today, all the sovereign pension funds globally or the infrastructure funds, they are actually coming in more on a brownfield side of it. And therefore, the greenfield is something that India needs to a little bit worry about. And therefore, I believe that on the PPP side, which is where the domestic private capital, the entrepreneurs who have built the sectors or these operating assets where let's say brownfield assets where the foreign capital is coming in, they are the ones who can execute the large projects, whether it is airport, roads, ports, etc. And therefore, for them to come back into the play, the PPP framework needs to be rebooted. You need to have an independent institution. You cannot leave it to the ministries. We have seen by repeated attempts, railways has not been able to come out with a sound PPP structure, which makes so much of capital is available, get into the sector. That's one. I think the second also the point which I am expecting, which has also become very, very important, is this entire energy transition, climate adaptation. I think if you really see what is happening, let's say in a Joshimath today, one thing which I really want to see in the budget is that how, when we are planning the infrastructure, the entire energy transition, the climate adaptation, the environmental side becomes a core to the planning exercise itself. While we talk about it, but I think there has to be a more solid way and a structured way to make it at a center. And lastly, I think if you think of energy transition, I think the sectors which are very carbon intensity and high emission carbon sector, we need to have a framework where we incentivize them and facilitate their transition to more energy friendly. Now, green steel, we are talking about a lot, green hydrogen, the government announced a lot. So how do you plan a lot of a funding for these initiatives, make it something and an incentives that the industry can get if they go on that path, and really probably find a way to have some sort of a carbon tax on some other sort of a users as well. I think that also probably give a balance without losing a sight of energy transition.
Fair enough. Interesting points there, Arindam.
Yeah, just a couple of issues to focus on. One is government would continue to spend as much as it can on infrastructure, but the real challenge is, as all of us are saying, is to attract non-government investment into infra, notably private sector investment. Now, the focus there should be on reforms and credit enhancement. Some of the mechanisms I have talked before, but if we were to look at a couple of other measures, I think reforms in some of the sectors, in the railway sector, for example, setting up an independent regulator. In the urban infrastructure sector, addressing this issue of low user charges on multiple projects, whether it's water supply, any kind of projects you talk about in the urban sector suffers from inability to levy adequate user charges. So having some sort of a reform mechanism supported by adequate regulations so that private sector interest is rekindled in those sectors, that would be another area of focus. Because beyond the point, government cannot support infrastructure investments. It needs to attract investment from outside. So I guess that should be the focus, along with whatever investments are possible.
I guess we'll have to wait till the 1st of February to see how it goes, because clearly from what I can gather, that on the plus, it looks like the government has figured out that it has to keep pushing the infrastructure space, and it is likely to kind of keep the investment in the infrastructure sector high, so that at least that is taken care of. But like both of you mentioned, I mean, infrastructure growth cannot happen on government funds alone. I mean, we have to find whatever sources we can, whether it's private sector, whether it's credit enhancement. Overall, I mean, we have to look at all the resources, and on that front, anything that comes out of the budget, that would be interesting. And another thing I feel that was interesting is, the focus on now energy transition becoming a big thing, and environment being incorporated in planning. That would be interesting. I mean, if they can, because Joshima is a tragedy waiting to happen, and it's not a one-off case. There are so many other instances that have literally shaken us, and we need to kind of pay attention to that as well. So, Arindam.
Just one last point, Rachita, if I may. I forgot to mention this, but if you look at, let's say, climate financing, the other area which we now need to focus on is carbon markets, because that could be a very, very useful way of financing certain projects. Even today, I think it's upscale in our country. It is focused on only certain sectors like energy, but even there, it's to a limited extent. So we need to get a full-fledged carbon market covering multiple sectors going.
I mean, I was about to say that point, and Arindam captured it very well. I think another one point which I sort of think will like to flag, which is also very important. See, ultimately, investments happen in the states in India, right? I mean, that's where the investments really happen in each of the states. I also strongly believe that if this central agency comes into play on the asset monetization, the state's monetization, which is a huge potential, investors are willing to come in. But what the states grapple with and what the investor challenge is that they don't find a standard framework. The process that the states want to run is very different than the way centers have done in the past. And we have a very great success stories around it. I think unless and until we as India, I'm talking more as a nation, we are able to push the states monetization, and they want to do that. It's not true that the states are averse to that, but they don't know how to do that. I mean, if we can really have that capacity building in some of the key states, getting that momentum going, trust me, the kind of capital that is waiting to come in either of the sectors, that will give a lot of a flip. And that is also important. If you analyze the data, while the center did their capex well on the last year budget, but the state capex has languished because they have been struggling post COVID. A lot of resources where they are spending the money but not on the capex. So unless and until we get the state asset monetization pushed up, this challenge will always have a limitation where center can do only a limited stuff, and we are not getting an entire India as a nation move forward from the entire economic vision that Prime Minister had.
Very relevant points. In fact, like Arindam said, I mean, the government has clear intent of, developing a carbon market. So we hope that the push is consistent and, that happens. And Manish, what you also said on states, I mean, of course, that would be a huge opportunity if we can streamline that. I hope the budget addresses these issues, and it's too close to the budget. So I don't know if FM is watching this and taking notes from our discussion, but there's no harm in hoping that that happens. We'll be in touch, and Moneycontrol will be looking at the budget very closely, bringing to you the highlights, the analysis, and covering it from all aspects. And Manish, Arindam, thank you so much for joining. Let's catch up after the budget and see what we have there for the infrastructure sector. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachita. Thanks, Arindam. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
1st February 2023, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present the last full union budget before 2024 elections. India's most awaited financial event comes in the midst of global slowdown, inflation, liquidity tightening, geopolitical tensions, and re-emergence of COVID-19. Will India look to fire up its manufacturing? Will India build a moat against global uncertainties? What will the budget have for the middle class? Watch the complete coverage of Budget 2023. Real-time analysis, expert takes all day on Moneycontrol. Log on to www.moneycontrol.com for more.